unnormalized form of an invoice. So we'll call this an invoice table having the following fields. We have an invoice number, which is right here next to invoice. We have invoice date, and we have customer name. We have customer address. Okay, so these are the fields which are non-redundant. What are the repeating fields? Pet name, procedure, and amount. We got invoice number, invoice date, customer name, address, pet name, procedure, and amount. Okay. Now let's see what is in the first normal form. So for one thing for sure in the first normal form is we need an invoice table. And for that purpose, all of these fields, invoice number, invoice date, customer name, customer address, all of that could easily float in here. An invoice number could be a representator for them. Now comes invoice pet, the second table. In this one, we need pet name, pet procedure, and amount, these three fields for sure. Okay. And the easiest bet would be that, okay, how about if I tie them up with an invoice number to be the foreign key between the two tables? But is that sufficient? Is it sufficient
As a foreign key?
as a foreign key also serving as a primary key?
I want to say a pet ID will
Yes.
serve as a primary key too.
So we will also include pet ID because we don't have pet ID in the original form, but we will have a pet ID here as well. But since this table is not about pets, this is about pets invoice. Therefore, we will make a combination of invoice number and pet ID because the same pet on this, there can be multiple pets on the same invoice. So an invoice ID, pet ID combination will be made because there are at least you have like, for example, we have two pets on the same invoice. So we are storing invoice and pet information as a combination, or the same pet ID. Yeah, I mean, like, we're going to just do that for here. So pet ID was selected and added as a key because pet name, being a character string, is not a good candidate. Okay. So second normal form. This table is already in the second normal form as there are no transitive, there are no partial dependencies. But in the invoice pet table, there is a partial dependency. And what is the partial dependency in invoice pet?
The amount. Wait. No, the customer name. Oh shit.
In invoice pet, what is the partial dependency? Which field is only dependent on one of the two primary keys?
The amount.
Amount is dependent on both because the amount relates to the pet who is on the invoice. Procedure is also about pet who is on the invoice. Name is the only field which has nothing to do with invoice. Because on the invoice, you charge for a procedure, right? So amount and procedure are both related to the invoice and the pet because it is the pet who is undergoing the procedure. But name is only associated with the pet ID. So we'll have a pet table where we will only have the pet ID and the pet name. And the pet ID will be the primary key there. And then we will have an invoice pet table where we will use the invoice number, the pet ID, their combination, and we will use the procedure and the amount. Okay, now comes another question. Are the tables in the second normal form, are all of them in the third normal form?
You could probably split procedure up into the procedure number. So the first two are, and then the
First two
third.
are. Okay, so let's move the first two. So we have the invoice and the pet already in the procedure. So invoice, invoice number, invoice date, customer name. That's a problem. This is not in the third normal form. Why?
Oh, because the name and the address.
Exactly, because that is customer information. That is nothing to do with invoice. So we will rather create another table called customer, and we will introduce customer number as a primary key to that table. And then we will move the customer name and customer address out here. And we will then link the two tables with customer number as a foreign key, or instead of doing that, let me italicize this. So customer number, customer name, customer address, that goes as a another table with its own primary key. We have pet information, and we have the pet invoice information.
So we would just have to come up with the other thing that makes the other table as possible. So like the customer number wasn't like there in the first one. So we will like through breaking the tables down into like their rawest form.
So when you are breaking the
Us,
tables down and you realize that the new table that is getting formed doesn't has any existing fields that could be treated as a primary key, so you can come up with a primary key field.
okay.
And then you will link the two tables, the one that's broken out and the previous one, with the common field, like we
So
did
that would
customer
like
number.
how you the customer number. So when you create the new primary key, it has to go back into the thing that you got it from.
Right, so that the invoice can be tied to a customer.
Okay.
Because at the end of the day, customer is paying the invoice, not the pet.